You may or may not know this, but Persona 3 is one of my favorite video games of all time. It's easily in my top 10, if not my top 5 games ever made. And I also think it has one of the most powerful messages that I've never quite encountered anything like it in any other game or media or show or movie. The way that Persona 3 handles its admittedly much more serious and sensitive material tends to be very sophisticated usually. And while its storytelling isn't perfect, and there tends to be a lot of different interpretation depending on the medium you're playing. Persona 3, the original game, can be very different to, say, the portable version or this brand new reload, and I've played basically every version of Persona 3. I've played the original, Persona 3 Fez, which has like an additional DLC, portable, the movies, manga, and so on. Like, there's a lot of Persona 3 media that I've consumed, and when it got announced that the reload would be coming, effectively a remaster of the original game, I was over the moon excited, to say the least. And I thought about scripting this entire video, but I thought about it and realized I didn't want to make this video too formulaic, and I want to speak a little bit more from the heart about a game that means so much to me. And this is not going to be an analysis of Persona 3 Reload story or anything. Like, the game's been out nearly 20 years, and if you want a story analysis, either go watch a different video or you can play the game yourself to experience it, which I highly recommend. Speaking of which, spoilers, there will be major spoilers for Persona 3. Even though we're not going to focus on the story that much, we will touch on it here and there where necessary. What I really want to do today is talk about the ways that it compares and differs to the original games. Because every time an old classic game gets remade, instead of, a faithful just upgrade, upscale remaster, inevitably things get changed, whether it be small subtle things like the atmosphere or the tone and visuals, or even very major things like in the case of Final Fantasy, the remake is quite different to the original game in many ways. And how does Persona 3 stack up against the original Persona 3 games? Is it more of a replacement or a companion piece to those? Now, it's made me happy to see that Persona 3 Reload has gotten such a positive reception so far, and the few but negative reviews that I've seen tend to compare it to Persona 5 most prominently. And while there is some utility in that, I don't think it's necessarily the best tool to judge if Persona 3 Reload is a good game. Because admittedly, while I do think Reload got what I'm going to call Persona 5'd in many ways, I'm not sure that's the best frame of reference, because you could easily just as much compare Reload to its original game. And by that measure, Reload looks absolutely stunning in just about every capacity, and I also think they didn't want to make a true evolution of Persona 5 with this remaster. That was not really the point. There's a lot of mechanics that admittedly did not age so well, or things that Persona 5 and even Persona 4 improved on, but I don't think they were trying to rectify all of those, because they would be changing the original experience too much. They would be bending that too strangely, I think. So to illustrate what I'm talking about, here's a perfect example about framing. Is Tartarus in the new Persona 3 Reload any good? Well, that completely depends on what you're comparing it to. If you're talking about Tartarus in comparison to the handcrafted palaces of Persona 5, then Tartarus is a boring, monotonous nightmare, and it's terrible. However, if you're comparing this Tartarus in Reload to the original experience of Persona 3, it is miles better. Like, it's night and day. It's not even close. There are a few elements of the old Tartarus that I think are kind of charming and unique, but by and large, the new Tartarus design and the things that you can do and the layouts and everything and the way that you interact and move about the environment is so much more player friendly than it was, in the original game, that it's not even close. Like, yes, Tartarus should get praised completely if compared to the original, but compared to Palaces, to be honest, like, I'm sleeping on that. Persona 3 Reload never set out to be the next evolution of Persona games or be a replacement for Persona 6 or anything. It just wanted to be the original game, but do some things slightly differently. So the reason I laid all that out is because I think your take on Persona 3 Reload depends almost entirely on what you're comparing it to. And I just want to establish that for the most part, I'm going to be comparing the Reload to its original experiences, the OG game, Fez, and even Portable. Now, I think it's pretty clear that Atlus and the developers and the leads on Persona 3 Reload wanted to make Persona 3 a much more digestible modern gaming experience, because they know that Persona 3 in its original form, if released today, would not be appealing to the broader gaming community, and I think that's true. So I can understand them wanting to do something a bit more familiar or accessible for a modern gaming player base, and that would mean some changes and some big ones that would need to be made. But they even self-admit that they know a lot of the charm and the specialness of the original original Persona 3 was in its rough edges and a lot of the things that hadn't been smoothed out. So let's just look at the big picture here. I think Persona 3 Reload did a plethora of things to its gameplay and greatly improved the original gameplay loop of Persona 3 in many ways. That includes combat and even the, day-to-day activities, social links, and so on. But I also feel that I think it loses some of its edge and its charm in its creative direction. Now, being very familiar with the original game and all of the little details that I've come to know and love over the years, I'm going to be acutely aware of any of those details that change from the original to the Reload. Now, in all fairness, some of the things in the original Persona 3 probably could do with some updating or needed to be changed, as maybe they were just in poor taste, some outdated or irrelevant humor, and so on. And I can understand them changing those things, but there's a few other ones that just leave me scratching my head and honestly yearning for the original experience, and I'll give you a few examples. Well, first is actually the opening cinematic. There's something about watching these cutscenes side by side that tells me everything I need to know about how this Reload is going to be handled from a, let's say a maturity perspective. And when I say opening cinematic, I mean both the title intro as well as the first in-game cinematic. They're both very different, and even the songs have changed too. As much as I really like Full Moon, Full Life, it's a great new song, and I think it fits the theme and tone of Persona 3 Reload really well. I don't think it fits the original game quite as much. You can tell that where the differences in its actual tone are going to be felt. Persona 3 Reload's opening is great, don't get me wrong, and I think the production value and the art direction is fantastic. I love it. However, it does feel like it's been softened a little bit. Its edges aren't quite as sharp as they used to be. The original Persona 3 opening feels like that game you shouldn't be playing. It's that thing in the back of your mind that your parents definitely wouldn't want you playing something like this. It felt, I hate to use the word edgy to describe it, that's probably the best descriptor at the moment. The Persona 3 Reload opening has a lot of those great moments and does capture a bit of that energy, but there's something about the opening of Portable and the original game that just isn't quite able to be replicated. I would also like to point out that Reload's intro makes C's feel a lot more like a big group of friends, when in the original game, most of the time they're very disconnected, and C's was never really the closest group of friends, at least at first, and I think that's conveyed brilliantly in both the original opening and Portables. And obviously, this fits the tone better for Reload because they are a little bit more friendly with each other and close than they were in the original games, which we'll get to a little bit later down the road. So not only do the opening titles for each respective game have a very different tone and atmosphere and feel to them, but even the first cinematic that kicks the whole game off. And we're going to go ahead and break these down, because what the original creators of Persona 3 understood is there's a lot you can tell to the player and convey feelings to them just through simple editing, or even not saying anything at all. Now, part of that is due to technical limitations where they couldn't maybe say as much dialogue as they would have liked to, and those technical limitations are no longer a problem, and I think they still went the wrong direction with it, which I'll explain, but let's go ahead and take a look at these. There's a very different energy that comes from both of these cutscenes. One of them is able to convey a lot without saying anything, and the other needs to kind of over-explain what's happening. I'll let you watch them.
Yeah, I'm at the station right now.
And there, that's all you need. Cuts to black, Yukari's crying, no words are spoken, and so much is conveyed. Now, let's look at how it's done in Reload.
Just put it to my head. And then pull the trigger. Come on. There's no way I can't.
And that's how the Reload intro goes. I know just you watching those two side by side, one of them made you feel very different than the other. And I'm not saying that I hate this intro or anything like that, but the original is able to cultivate so much more tension, even to a point of almost making you feel uncomfortable or anxiety inducing. This Reload intro has like the literal events of what's happening, but edited in a way that loses all of the energy. And I also think Yukari speaking in this was the worst thing they could have done. Her not saying anything in the original intro was one of the most powerful things about it. Now, if I'm being totally fair, I can't just dock Reload on points for this because Persona 3 Portable also has the same problem. Yukari speaks in this moment, which I do think deflates a lot of the tension, but I think that's due to Portable's technical limitations, and they couldn't have the actual cinematic, so they need to sort of explain what's happening through text more often than not. And I get that. However, those technical limitations are not a problem with Reload, so theoretically we should have been able to have that really anxiety-inducing editing going on still. I think they were afraid of making their audience too uncomfortable and off-put so early in the game. But again, part of that uncomfortableness was its appeal in some sense. Now, we're not going to go scene by scene comparing every single one to its Reload counterpart. I just want to take a look at one more example, but you can basically assume that a lot of what I'm talking about in terms of the energy that's lost in these cutscenes can be applicable to almost all of them in Reload. There are some cases where I think it's the opposite and Reload does its cutscene better, and I'll point out those moments if I do see it, but I want to take a look at one more example, because just like the intro, this is one of the most important moments in the game, and this is the protagonist or Makoto's awakening.
Those monsters. We call them shadows.
Go on. Persona.
And perfect. Beautiful awakening scene with a proper amount of time to let everything kind of slow down and then pick back up again. The pacing is just brilliant. Now, let's look at reloads.
No way! That's it! One of the monsters that attacked us! It's a shadow!
Go on.
And that's the reload version. Now, I don't think this one is as poorly edited as the intro cutscene is, and there's actually a few things that I like in Reload's version more than the original, particularly the stuff with Yukari. I think my problem is I just greatly prefer how slow the original tried to build up that moment of the first awakening. That's such like an important moment in the entire cutscene, and I think it just goes by a little too fast in Reload. Like, it's not paced properly. Not to mention, Thanatos literally ripping Orpheus apart is a lot more visceral natural in the original cut, and Reload feels like it's been softened up to some degree. Now, we could sit here and pick apart cutscenes all day, but I don't really want to do that because there's many moments in depictions of certain events in the game that I prefer across all of the mediums. Like, there's certain depictions and interpretations that I prefer in the original game, there's some things that I actually prefer how Reload does it, and there's stuff that I prefer the most how the Persona 3 movies handle it as well. So what I'm getting at is there are multiple interpretations of events and moments that are handled much differently depending on what you're playing or watching. And so to get the most well-rounded view, I recommend playing the original game, Reload, and watching the movies, because it's a mixed bag of what interpretations of certain events I prefer. And this was just a few examples, but I hope this shows that I do think in general, Reload does have its edges softened compared to the original game. And once again, they admitted that's what they were doing, and I do feel there was a conscious effort to not make the player overly uncomfortable with this Reload, because the original game had the danger of doing that, especially for a modern audience. But let's put that stuff on the shelf for now, and maybe we'll come back to it a bit later. I want to talk about gameplay, because as much as these scene comparisons made Persona 3 look like the perfect game or the gold standard, Persona 3 is certainly no perfect game, and that's made abundantly clear when you take a look at the structure of the day-to-day experience part of the gameplay, and even Tartarus in combat, which we'll talk about in just a second. But Persona 3 would introduce practically the game-defining mechanic that all Persona games are fundamentally built on now, which is the time management system. Now, I'm going to assume that everybody watching this video is at least vaguely familiar with how Persona 3 gameplay works, which is during the day, you have the option to participate in social activities or hang out with people, which will in turn give you the ability to make stronger personas, or you can do things that will increase your stats, like your charm or your academics. You can study, you can go, to the cafe, and so on. Like, you can do daily activities to increase these RPG player mechanics, and then during the nighttime, you can either choose to do these exclusive nighttime activities, or you can go to Tartarus. One of the biggest problems with the original Persona 3 is that the game is so front-loaded with daytime activities and social links that it leaves nighttime very barren feeling, and this is made even worse when you play something like Persona 5 Royal, where the nighttime activities are almost as stacked as the day. It just isn't the case here, and this is made, deliberately, because I think the design was, you're supposed to go to Tartarus almost every night and kind of chunk away at it every so often, but I think the way a lot of people play, including myself, is you basically try to stretch as far as you can into Tartarus for one night, and then you'll have basically 2 or 3 weeks to do nothing during the nighttime except go to sleep. One of the best things Persona 3 Reload did was take a lot of effort to alleviate this problem, most particularly through a lot of expansion in the already existing places and mechanics you can interact with, like going to the nightclub is now a lot more interactive than it was before, and then you even have these nighttime episode activities where you can spend time hanging out with a member of C's, and you'll get a reward for it. They may even get some new combat abilities, and you'll get some items to use in Tartarus, and so on. Now, when I said earlier that I feel Reload got Persona 5'd in a lot of ways, I mean that in both a negative and a positive way. The negative we already covered. I think, being Persona 5'd in some sense made it lose a little bit of its charm in areas that we've already covered, but it does come with a few upsides, and this being the overall UI design is much more player friendly. Like, the old UI in Persona 3 was very minimal, and it was non-descriptive with its icons and text and stuff like that. It was a bit harder to navigate and a little bit more obtuse. With the complete overhaul of the interface in just about every capacity, I have to say the quality of life changes are much appreciated. Even though you can clearly tell that they used the Persona 5 bones and blueprints to make this menu and UI design, I think that's totally fine, and it's also not quite as flashy or over the top or rebellious as Persona 5's menu was, and it's a lot more chilled out while still retaining a lot of the charm and aesthetic of the original design too. Persona 3 Reload introduced a lot of brand new mechanics, most of them for the better and very positive ones. However, it also took away some features from the original, and the ones that I was most sad to see go are the condition system and also the change to social links. Now, when it comes to the party condition system, the way this works is each character had a little icon representing how they were feeling. You had excellent condition, you had normal good condition, a bad one, and then also sick. And depending on how your player was feeling or your character was doing, they would either deal more damage in combat if they were in excellent condition, that is. However, if they were tired or sick, their evasion would go down, they'd become more susceptible to status ailments and so on. And occasionally, your party members would get sick for reasons completely out of your control, which was slightly annoying, but is something that added a bit of decision making to the gameplay. Also, this interplayed with what you do at school, because you could choose to go to sleep during school during like a lecture or something, and you would have a better chance of being in good physical condition for Tartarus, but you would miss out on something like attaining more academics or charm or something like that. This required you to exercise a bit of forethought if you even wanted to go to Tartarus that night, if it would be worth it and stuff like that. And while the class system still is here where like you can choose to stay up or go to sleep, it pretty much only alternates between obtaining more charm or courage. This doesn't have any effect on your battle condition or your party or anything you do in Tartarus. Persona 3 Reload specifically also opened up more nighttime activities where you can go to Iwatodai Strip Mall instead of just being relegated to the dorm or the mall area. And this makes the condition system even more irrelevant because there's less of that decision making of if you want to go that night and stuff like that. Now, for people who have only played Persona 4 or 5 or Royal, you'll know that interacting with your friends and your colleagues, your relationships can only move forward. However, in Persona 3, your relationships can be reversed if you say the wrong thing during dialogue or do something bad to them. And in the original game, this was even more brutal because while they can still be reversed in Persona 3 Reload, you can prevent your relationships from still moving forward. If you really pushed it in the old game, you could outright break your relationships, which would prevent you from fusing those personas in the Velvet Room. This was a very brutal punishment for treating people poorly or making the wrong decisions, but I think that's fine. I wish they would have brought the system to where you could break those. It just makes, all of the choices and dialogue options you choose have much more weight and impact to them. In the old game, everything you said mattered, and that's still partly true in Reload, just a little bit less so due to the fact that there is less permanent punishment now. Like, for example, they even changed a few of the social links that were important to those reversals. Yukari's is the most iconic one, where she basically is about to be jumped and or assaulted by these guys, and you come through and save her, and if you make the wrong decision in the original game by trying to hug her, she gets absolutely pissed off at you, and your relationship then reverses. And they don't really set you up for that in this, or at least it's not the same. They give you dialogue options, but it's pretty clear which one you shouldn't pick. And there's a lot of these decision-making moments in all of the social links where it could potentially become reversed, where you're able to skirt that a lot easier than you were in the original game. Speaking of impact and weight, this new Reload has a rewind system, which allows you to turn back time a little bit in case you make a wrong decision. While I feel very conflicted on this because on one hand, I like the idea of it. If you accidentally mess something up and want to go back and correct something, I think that's partly cool, but it makes you having to live with the impact of what you did much lessened. And let's not pretend that in the original game, people didn't just make save states and things like that to go back and correct a mistake if you made one, but still, it feels like the game is almost partially encouraging it, making everybody's playthrough more or less the same. I just found the reversals to not play as much of a role as they did before, and the inability to break relationships makes it feel like it doesn't have any ultimate weight. Now, the thing is, with Persona 3's social links, they're a bit all over the place, and I mean that in the original game too. Reload more or less keeps all of them intact, with the added benefit of making everything voice acted now, which is a benefit in a lot of ways. There were some characters that I grew to love, and I think their voice acting elevated their characters to such a level that made them unforgettable. For example, Akinari is one of the characters that I liked in the original Persona 3, but I loved in Reload, particularly because of his voice acting. He's a young man dying from a hereditary disease, presumably some kind of cancer, and you're not able to help him with any of your powers. He just wants somebody to spend time with him. You stand there by him because even though there's nothing you can do at all to help him, he wants to finish his story and help find some kind of meaning in his life. The new voice-acted social links really made a lot of them stand out or hit in a different kind of way that I'd never experienced in the original game, and that is one of the biggest upsides to these voice-acted social links in Reload. I think they did an excellent job with these. Again, admittedly, some of the social links are way less interesting than others. Got to a point where you really end up caring genuinely about these characters, and the time you spent is very valuable. So much so that near the end of the game, even though I had maxed out a lot of the social links, I would still spend ample time doing nothing with my favorite characters just because I wanted to be around them more. Minus a few lame ones, I think overall Persona 3 still has my favorite lineup of social links and their characters, maybe right next to Royal. While we're sort of on the topic of social links, I want to segue into some of the new added story elements exclusively in Reload. And a lot of the new story elements come in the form of these nighttime activities where you hang out with a member of C's, and I genuinely really enjoyed these because you get a lot more characterization of some of the members that don't get, enough spotlight in the original game. So for those unaware, in the original Persona 3, you couldn't actually hang out with any of the male party members and develop social links with them if you were playing as Makoto. Now, the only exception to this is in the portable version, you can play as the female main character, in which you can hang out with the male party members, and it's a bit of like a different timeline. It's not that stuff gets weird from there, so we won't really go down that rabbit hole. But in Reload, you can hang out with the male party members now, but they're not really social links, but you get some great story stuff and like exclusive items that you can only do by developing those. You learn about Shinji and his past, which was a criminally underdeveloped part of the story in the original game. You learn about Akihiko and his foster parents and his sister. You learn about Ken and the dark place his head was at, and you even learn about Junpei's inferiority complex, more or less stemming from when he played baseball. All of this new additional story is fantastic and one of the best things Reload did. They also gave much more characterization with Takaya, another element of Persona 3 that I felt was a bit underdeveloped, mostly in the games, was Strega, and Takaya gets a lot more one-on-one time with Makoto, and they talk and they really get to, discuss ideologies and where they absolutely conflict. Takaya attempts to genuinely explain where him and Strega are coming from, and the fact that they don't want the Dark Hour to be destroyed, as it would mean the elimination of their powers, and thus potentially your purpose if you're a Persona user. And so you can see where he's coming from, even if you fundamentally disagree with it. I really like their interactions a lot, and they are paced well throughout the plot, because the actual plot of Persona 3 does have a few pacing issues, and that are still present in Reload. Okay, so let's move on to changes in Tartarus and the complete overhaul of the combat system, because while I think they still wanted to retain a lot of the DNA that made the original Persona 3's combat work, they also have expanded it a lot to where it is much more akin to Persona 5 now. Now let's talk about that for a second, because I think a lot of people who just played Reload and not the original found Tartarus to be extremely grindy and boring, and I get that, I totally do. And even in the original experience, I would say that's probably true for most cases. There are some charming things I like about the old Tartarus, but in many ways the new one is significantly better, and it's also not trying to be Persona 5 Palaces. I've seen people directly comparing Persona 3 Tartarus to Palaces, and I just think that's not a fair comparison, and I'm sure the thought even crossed their mind of like, oh, what if we just completely redesigned how the dungeon crawling works in Reload? But I don't think they wanted to do that because it would be straying away from the original vision far too much. They know Tartarus is boring in the original game, and they still want to make Tartarus and not a palace, and I get that. So the trick was finding a happy medium between modernizing the gameplay and maintaining the original vision, which is a tough task, I will give them that. And for what it's worth, I'm gonna say I'm very positive on the new Tartarus. There is a few things in particular to the charm and aesthetic that I think is lost in translation, but generally speaking, from a gameplay perspective, Tartarus was significantly less tedious and grindy than it has been in the original game, and also portable. It has the same general outline, like all of the floors are randomly generated, you have a couple of treasure chests, but you have this new system called Twilight Fragments, which I don't think I hear people talk enough about. These are little items that you find throughout the world, or by doing quests for Elizabeth or something like that, that you can use to open secret chests within Tartarus itself. The Twilight Fragment system is absolutely genius and gives you a lot more to strive for and interact with than just, beating up shadows and opening chests in the original. I found the refreshed Tartarus to be a very pleasurable experience, and I mean that mechanically. I think what it gains in quality of life and gameplay mechanics that are fun, it loses in atmosphere and charm. Now, when it comes to combat, Reload makes a few major changes that were not part of the original at all. So in the original game, you had the one more system, which attacking an enemy weakness would grant you another turn. And then after, you have a neutral attack or something, it would move on to the next person's turn. However, in Reload, you're actually able to do something called shifting, which is equivalent to passing the baton in Persona 5. Now, you don't get nearly as much of the damage benefits that you would from passing around the baton. It's not as emphasized in this game, but it is possible, and this fundamentally changes how combat flows. And I think what it most greatly impacts is how physical skills are balanced in Persona 3. If you've only played Persona 5 or Royal, physical skills are just one thing, basically. And in Persona 3, you have 3 different types of physical. You have Slash, Strike, strike, and pierce, and these can all be their own individual weakness or strength. And what this means is that generally speaking, physical builds are going to be the best because you can strike weaknesses and pass back to like the main character and just dish out physical damage and kill every battle essentially. So it feels like the combat mechanics have been much more modernized, but the enemy balance and mechanics didn't modernize alongside it. So it's a very strange juxtaposition. And also let's talk about the new mechanic of theurgies, or what are basically limit breaks. These are special one-time use abilities specific to each character that will charge at different rates depending on their personality. So for example, Yukari's limit break will charge faster if she heals the party, or Mitsuru's will charge faster if she deals status ailments to enemies, and so on. And while everybody's limit break is going to charge to some degree by just participating in combat, you can kind of leverage their personalities to charge them faster if you want. And these are pretty broken, to be honest. And this is also where the main character's fusion spells come from, as that was a big mechanic in the original game. It's been reworked here where that is now part of your limit break. Simply having certain personas in your compendium will give you access to different abilities, and some of them are insane. But the thing is, the big flaw in the system, I think, is that it's very easy just to stack limit breaks and maintain them up until you get to the floor guardians, or basically what are the gatekeepers in this game, and then just use it all for that final battle. Because a lot of what made those mini bosses tough was requiring the right team composition and elemental weaknesses you can exploit and stuff, but the limit breaks will deal that certain elemental damage, ignoring their resistances. So the dominant meta ended up being something like farm regular enemies in Tartarus, get to gatekeeper, and then use your limit breaks on your first turn, and then at that point you're already probably a fair chunk of the way through the fight, and then it becomes a lot more digestible. So I don't dislike this system as a whole, but I think it needed some tuning. And let's also talk about how the monad doors work. So monad was its own block in Tartarus in the original game, but they essentially separated out into randomized doors throughout the different blocks of Tartarus, and then each one has like a special monad door near the end. Outside of these normal monad doors, you're going to encounter mini bosses that are quite akin to the gatekeepers in terms of strength and power. They're going to give you about the same amount of trouble, but once you defeat them, located behind them will be these treasure chests that have all kinds of goodies that you can use in the antique store to get some of the best gear in the game. This is a little bit different to how the like fusion system worked in the original Persona 3, where you actually fused a persona of yours into a weapon. This is a little bit more like gathering very rare materials to create these said weapons, and you don't actually fuse your personas into these anymore, which does reduce a little bit of the incentive, I think, to make good personas that would make good weapons, but that's neither here nor there. Point is, a new system in Reload is the fact that you will get one of these Arcana cards at the end of each special monad door on a block, and then these will give you the ability to obtain these during the shuffle time after a battle. And obtaining these certain Arcana cards will give you like a new condition. For example, it will raise the stats on your current persona, or you'll be more likely, you know, to get a certain item throughout your time in Tartarus, or it'll raise your social links, stuff like that. It's a really fun little mini game that is a replacement for how shuffle time used to work. It just randomized your cards, and it was either basically getting XP, health, or some kind of weapon, and that was about it. They also had a card that would attract the Reaper, which as far as I'm aware isn't actually a thing in this game. Like, the Reaper's still here, but the card that attracts him is no longer part of the shuffle time, I believe, and they got rid of the randomization system entirely. At this point, I'm not even sure why it's called shuffle time still if the cards don't actually shuffle anymore, but it's whatever, I guess. Outside of Tartarus combat, I don't have much to comment on because the full moon events are more or less intact from how they were in the original, mechanically speaking. The only differences are occasional movesets that are a bit different, and also, most prominently, its aesthetic. A lot of the bosses and their arenas in particular, they just don't have the same aesthetic flair as the old ones do, and it's not because of a lack of technical limitations or anything. I have this theory that the older games, more specifically wanted to go after a more unique looking background because maybe they couldn't do everything mechanically that they had ideas for. So they really wanted to sell the atmosphere and make the visuals something that stands out. However, in the new game, I think they focused a bit more on the actual mechanics of the boss and forgot about these subtle details that make the atmosphere work. For example, the shadow located underground with all the wires, like, this looks far more menacing in the original game. And even like the tank enemy, I would say this atmosphere looks way more threatening than how it does in Reload. And then unfortunately, I have to say the same for the Nyx arena. This just doesn't work. They bathed him in like lime green, where I don't recall much green being in the original game, like maybe a hint of it, but that was more just like the eerie reflection of the Dark Hour itself. I think that's the problem. The depiction of the Dark Hour and the color scheme they use for it just feels a little bit off. Like, I found myself not quite as immersed in the environment when I was in the Dark Hour in this game, and I don't think it's because I've already seen it before and I've played the game. I actually think it's because the color design is not very dialed in. I think it's a strange choice that they had to just bathe everything in like this lime green. Like in the Nyx arena, the floor looks like a laser tag arena or something. It just looks a bit silly, and that's the only word for it. And I think that's what took me out of it occasionally. Is I know that sounds like a nitpick, but the color scheme of the Dark Hour was just a bit off. Now, speaking of nitpicks, I'm gonna get this one out of the way right now. I understand this is a nitpick, but I'm gonna say it. I hate the new evoker sound. Okay, I mean, I don't hate it, but I greatly prefer the original sound. The OG one sounded like so beefy. Like, let me just give you a listen between these two.
Check this out. Hey, my command.
Look, I understand how incredibly nitpicky that sounds, but when you play something for so long and get used to these sounds that you're hearing all of the time in combat, and then for them to suddenly change, like, your brain is gonna notice it. And I think I'm still yearning for the classic sound. I just think it's a better sound for the situation overall, but I just prefer it. Now, this is another one of those things where it feels like the charm had been stripped away from the game, or the thing that very much made it special has been removed. Persona 3 is the only Persona game where you, as the main character, are able to use whatever weapon you like, and I mean weapon class. Like, so in Persona 3 Reload, you can basically only use swords. However, in the original game and in Fez, you can use anything you want. You can use bow and arrows, boxing gloves, spears, like, you name it. And this had a deeper effect of just simply being a different weapon. It actually changed how you engage with, Shadows and Tartarus. You could be a bit more elusive and try to snipe them with an arrow, or you could use the big hammer and like have a giant big wind up and really predict where you think their movement's going to be, so you don't get caught off guard. And this actually changed the way that you interact with the environment, even in a very small way. And on top of that, it's not a gameplay thing, but depending on the weapon you'd use, you'd have different evoker lines. You know, if you're using something like the bow and arrow, Makoto would have more chivalristic sounding lines when summoning his persona, and like different victory poses and stuff. It's just little things like that that you can tell a lot of love and passion went into this game, getting all of these unique animations for the main character and stuff. But you're only able to use one weapon type in Reload, which again, I'm not bent out of shape about this, but it is one of those things that's you're kind of sad to see it go. Now, let's talk about the last month of the game, in which all of the plot twists have been revealed. After you refuse to kill Ryoji and accept the fate of Nyx, and thus death and the end of the world, you then have to play out one more month before Nyx's arrival. And this is where everything completely changes. The score is very different on your day-to-day activities. The city you're in starts to feel very different than it did before, and you are overwhelmed with this sense of dread and hopelessness, and it paints an eerily similar picture to some of the worst cities in real life. It feels a little bit too close to home sometimes. You can see that death by despair is inevitable, apathy syndrome has fully taken hold, and the only thing people have left is Strega's, fake prophecy about Nyx. And thus, after overcoming and defeating Strega, and even defeating Nyx himself, or at least temporarily, Makoto makes the ultimate sacrifice and takes on the power of the universe with the help of all of his friends and people he's met along the way to seal away Nyx for good. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the ending, because the ending of Persona 3 is one of the most powerful endings to any piece of media that I've ever experienced. And I mean the Reload in that category as well. I do still prefer the original ending overall, and I'll explain why in just a second, but everything starts to snap into place once you realize what's going on. And also, you come to realize in this moment that, yes, Makoto's been the main character of the story, and that's who you've been playing as this whole time, but it starts to sink in that this story is really about Aigis. She was a robot that had a directive, and once she could not fulfill that directive and no longer had one, then she had no reason to exist. She had to find her own reason to live. Her reason for living became to discover her own purpose. In some real sense, this story is about finding your own purpose as an individual as you go throughout this life, which we all do, and I don't think you get a message more fundamental than that. You realize realize the point of life is to spend it with the ones you love, and this is exemplified perfectly in the final shot as his friends come up to the rooftop one last time to see him go. I really enjoyed how they portrayed this ending. It does have a much higher production value than what was felt in the original game. However, there's only one small gripe that I have, and it's the fact that they changed perhaps my favorite line in anything ever. Now, granted, it's not like they changed the line completely, it's just that they worded it in a way that sort of strips it from its original intention, I think. It doesn't feel as powerful as the way that the original one does, in my opinion. The point is, you don't need to be on some messianic complex to save the entire world in your life to have any kind of purpose or meaning. Sometimes you just need somebody to take care of, and that can be enough. I feel like I could sit here and compare the original game and its scene directions, its gameplay, and everything to Reload all day, and this video would probably be 18 hours long, and nobody wants to watch that. And if I sound like I've been very negative on Reload, I don't want it to come across that way at all. I think I just have a better time, an easier time explaining and expressing myself when I dislike something rather than praising something that I like, even though that is the case. Even though I have my nitpicks with Reload, all things considered, the improvements to the gameplay, the way that they maintained the heart and spirit of the original Persona 3 through a lot of the social links and many of the design choices, I have to commend them for. I would still give Persona 3 Reload probably a 9.5 out of 10. I think that's a very, very high rating. I may even feel a little bit differently after the answer comes out in September. That will be the full Persona 3 experience, because that's the other thing. This is lacking a little bit of additional content, in particular the answer, which we'll be releasing, but also in Portable, you don't have any of the female main character stuff, and so I don't think Reload is necessarily a replacement for the original game. Does it keep all of the major stuff intact and more or less reconvey the story that the original Persona 3 was going for? Absolutely. Do I have a problem with some of the direction and handling of the characters and cutscenes and stuff like that? Sure. I think it lost a little bit of its edge in this entire process. Would I recommend Persona 3 Reload on its own? Absolutely yes. Play this, and if you love the characters, you love this world and are attached to them, which, you probably will be by the end of this, I still recommend playing the original. Reload is not a replacement. I think it's more of a companion piece to everything else. Hell, even play Portable if you want. Persona 3 is one of my favorite games of all time, and a remaster being so near and dear to my heart, I do think it did Persona 3 enough of a justice to be played, but I still think it's a companion piece to the original, and they should sit alongside each other. This is not a replacement for it.